What the heck? Hey guys, today on What the Tech, we're going to be taking a look at the new Wolverine Airsoft WRAITH CO2 Stock. We're going to take a look at the installation and also take a look at how to install the dual air sourcing kit that we're going to be offering. So let's jump right into it. So today we're going to take a look at how to do the WRAITH installation. In this gun we have a Gen 2 Inferno, and we're also going to take a look at how to install the dual air sourcing kit. Now you might notice there's no Airline here. That's because the WRAITH is already installed in this gun. The way we're going to run this video is we are going to tear it down, go through that real quickly. We're going to show you what modifications were made and how you go about making them, and then we're going to go ahead and install the dual air sourcing kit and put it all back together. So let's get started. Alright, so we got this all torn down. You can see it tore down pretty much like standard M4. No real differences there. There are basically three things we need to do in order to make the WRAITH stock fit. The first is to trim off a little bit on the back of the gearbox here. Generally, we want to remove about 7 to 8 millimeters of material off the back edge of the gearbox. So before we get started, I want to talk about a few tools that you're going to want to collect before you go. First is the tool that you're going to use to make a couple of cuts. One is to trim the back edge of the gearbox. The other is to trim the stud on the back of or what we call the tailpiece on the back of the receiver. There's a few tools you can use for this. You can use a hacksaw. It's a little bit slow and tedious, but can be done. You can use a Dremel with a cutoff wheel, like this here. That will definitely work. Our favorite for these cuts, because they are just straight cuts and easy to access, is an angle grinder with a cutoff wheel. This will do each of the two cuts in about 10 to 15 seconds. So you're going to need a cutting tool. You're also going to need a drill with a 3/8 or a 10 millimeter drill bit. Either one will work, 3/8 or 10 millimeter. But if you're in the US, you'll probably have an easier time finding a 3/8. If you're overseas, a 10 millimeter is going to be easier to come by. Other than that, you're basically just going to need your standard tools for disassembling your gun. Let's go ahead and take the WRAITH stock off and take a look at how we modified the receiver. Oh, and I forgot to mention, you're also going to want either a 1/2-inch wrench or, better yet, a 1/2-inch socket. To get the back off, we're going to use the 1/2-inch wrench to loosen up the nut at the back here. This is generally going to be a lot easier if you have already loosened the castle nut here, because the castle nut tensions the whole thing together, and you'll end up putting a lot of torque on that might make it difficult to get off. So go ahead and loosen the castle nut off first using a standard armorer's wrench. We're just going to remove this nut from the inside. At that point, the whole thing will come apart. And here you see these are the parts that you're going to get with your WRAITH CO2 stock. You're going to get the entire buffer tube, which includes the CO2 adapter section here. It includes the buffer tube itself, castle nut, the sling plate, and this nut. You're also going to get a couple of Allen wrenches. One is going to be for the pressure adjustment here, and the other is going to be for your two screws on the bottom side here. And we'll address what those do in a separate video about setting up and tuning the WRAITH. A few other things you might want to think about picking up before you get started on the job. A set of soft jaws for your vise. We highly recommend having a vise to hold the receiver and the gearbox in while you're cutting them. It will make your modifications much more precise if what you're trying to cut is not moving around. And these will prevent the vise from damaging your part. The other is a set of calipers. Either standard or English will work. We will try to give all the dimensions in both so that you have an idea what you're doing. So there are two basic things that we need to do. One is to modify the receiver, the other is to modify the gearbox. On the receiver, we want to shorten the tailpiece here. These are different lengths depending on the brand that you have. But what we want is approximately 3/16 of an inch off the back surface of the receiver here. Or if you're working in metric, about 4.5 millimeters off the back surface here. So to modify the receiver, what we're going to do is we're going to set our calipers to 4.5 millimeters. And what we're going to do is we're going to use the back side of the calipers here and run it along the tailpiece of the receiver here, and you're going to scribe a line using the sharp point on the calipers there, and that line is what's going to mark and tell you where you need to make your cut. So let's set that aside, and then we'll mark the gearbox the same way. We're going to set it to right about 7 millimeters, and we're going to scribe a line up, tracking this edge along with the back side of the gearbox, and just mark where you want to cut. It doesn't have to be exactly at 7 millimeters. 7 to 8 millimeters is perfectly fine. It's not really critical. You're going to come in sort of through the middle of the screw at the back of the gearbox on most gearboxes. With that marked, you can then step over to your cutting station, which obviously we've already done the cuts here, but you can cut along those lines with whatever method you like. For the gearbox, we highly recommend putting all the screws back in, hold it together in the vise with your soft jaws, hold it right about like that, and make your cut. Again, angle grinder will do that in about 10 to 15 seconds. You're going to do exactly the same thing with your receiver. Again, we're going to put the receiver in the soft jaws, and we're going to go ahead and make our cut with whatever tool we've chosen. With that done, there's only one final step, and that is the hole at the back of the gearbox here needs to be enlarged. It comes at about 5.5 millimeters, 5.5 to 6 millimeters, depending on the brand, and we need to drill it out to 3/8 of an inch. This is where our drill comes in. If you're using a 3/8 of an inch drill bit, you're probably going to want to run the drill bit through a few times to open up the hole a little on the loose side of 3/8. The 10 millimeter is a little larger than 3/8, so it'll open it up a little more anyway. We're putting a 3/8 inch bolt through that hole, so it needs to be just a hair over 3/8. So if you just kind of run the drill bit through a few times, it'll loosen it up plenty to make that fit. With that done, you can see our hole there. All the modifications to the gun itself are done. So let's go ahead and talk about what we do with the Airline. So your Gen 2 Inferno is going to come with an Airline that looks something like this. The WRAITH will include a little piece of Airline and a fitting like this. All right, this is a good time to mention that the fitting on the back of the units did change between the Gen 1 Inferno, which uses the same fitting as the original SMP and the Hydra, and the Gen 2 Inferno, which uses a smaller fitting. For the time being, we're going to include both fittings with the kit, and you can press your piece of Airline here onto whichever barb you need. Eventually, we're going to switch over to just including the Gen 2 fitting, and if you need the Gen 1 fitting, you'll want to get in touch with us so that we can provide that for you, or contact your local retailer and they can order it from us. So to swap out the Airline, you're going to take a 1/4 inch wrench. This one's already loose, so I'm just going to unscrew it. 1/4 inch wrench, take the Airline off. Put the new piece of Airline on, use your 1/4 inch wrench again, and just snug it down. You don't want to over tighten it. There doesn't need to be a lot of torque on it. At that point, your Airline is swapped. You can see it has this reinforcement on it that helps prevent the Airline from buckling when it's installed in the system, because there's pressure here and there's no retention on the fitting that this slides into. So that's going to be our Airline swap. Let's talk about electronics for a minute. You can see in this one we have our Spartan edition that has the FCU inside the gun, and all we have coming out is the battery. And this is really convenient because obviously with the WRAITH CO2 stock, you're not going to be able to put your electronics in the buffer tube, and the battery fits really conveniently in the grip. This becomes especially relevant when we're talking about using the dual air sourcing kit, because now we're going to have an Airline running through our grip. While you can squeeze in the FCU and the battery into the grip with the Airline and the fitting, it is really tight, and it's not easy to do, and there's probably some risk of accidentally damaging the electronics while you're doing it. The alternative would be to run the electronics up front. If you have a PEC box or a traditional handguard that will fit the electronics up front, if you want to do that, you generally are going to want to remove the barrel, run the wiring through, put the barrel back on, and that can be made to work as well. We also have put it in a vertical grip. I'll show you an example of that. This is the MFT vertical grip, and it has the battery and wire harness and FCU all up inside there. If you're going to do this though, or possibly a PEC box, you're probably going to want the 18-inch wire harness so that you can disassemble the gun and separate the upper and lower receiver without having to completely remove the gearbox and the wiring and all that kind of stuff. So at this point, if we were going to just reinstall the WRAITH stock without the air splitter, we'd just reassemble everything. So we're going to go ahead and disassemble the gearbox here, and we're going to install the dual air sourcing kit. And what that lets us do is it lets us run either the WRAITH CO2 stock, or we can seamlessly transition over to external air. It is regulated external air, not unregulated. You also probably could use this with the in-grip regulator if you wanted to use unregulated external air or CO2, but we haven't tested that yet. Pretty sure it would fit, but I've not gotten to test that one yet. So let's talk about what is included with the kit. In your kit here, you're going to have a length of tubing. This is 6mm polyurethane tubing. You're going to have this little T assembly that has a check valve, 3 fittings. It's going to sit right here. And then you're going to have this guy. This is a new version of our grip connect. This is a filtered grip connect. Like our filtered grip line, it's a 2-piece assembly that has a filter inside it to help keep dirt and debris out of your system. So this is going to be our grip connect, our T fitting, and then we have some Airline to connect everything together. Let's go ahead and pull the unit out of the gearbox. We are going to need to trim down this length of tubing. So we can stick the fitting in the middle here. There's a barbed fitting inside the end here, and you want enough length there. So we want to trim it right about there. We'll measure that, but that should be right about 25, 26 millimeters, or right about an inch. And that should be pretty good right there. So again, I'm going to lock my calipers. I'm just going to use that to mark the tubing there, where we want to cut. There's still a layer of the reinforcement on there. We could remove that if we want, but it's not really going to hurt anything. So we're just going to leave it on there, and we're going to press these together. It does not matter the orientation here. If you do disassemble this, however, notice that there's an arrow on the body, and that the arrow needs to go towards the T. All right, because that's the direction of flow. The check valve only allows flow in one direction. All right, so we just pressed that on there. Not too difficult. And we want to press it as far as we can on up to the shoulder there. And we can see this is going to fit inside there. Now, some of you that have reinforced gearboxes, this is going to be more problematic. This is a VFC gearbox. It's wide open. There's no problem. If you have a heavily reinforced gearbox, you're going to have to make some space here in order if you want to install this kit. There are quite a few brands, though, that are wide open. The VFC is that way. I believe GMP gearboxes are also pretty much wide open. There's several brands out there that don't have a lot of reinforcement, and they definitely are the easiest ones to do this with. Now, I'm going to trim off about a 1/4 inch of the Airline off the other half that I cut off of the stock there, and that's just going to allow for the thickness here. 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch should be fine. It's not going to be super critical. And now I'm going to install that on the barb on the opposite side. Before we do that, I am going to pull off that extra piece of heat shrink. Alrighty, so there we go. So we've got 2 of our barbs attached for our T's. You do want to make sure that you're not just pushing the sleeving up here. If it makes you feel better, just trim that all the way off so you can see, that it's not sliding. Basically, we just want to make sure that's pushed all the way up onto the barb. The tubing itself is on the barb, not just the sleeving here has slid up over top. Now we are going to take our length of tubing that came with our dual air sourcing kit. We are going to attach it down here. Voila! Now I can just reassemble the gearbox. Alright, so let's go ahead and look at how to install the fitting itself in the grip base plate. In the case of this gun, which is an Elite Force 4 CRS, the threads on the fitting just match the threads on the base plate. There are different threads used in the industry though, so you're going to have to check on your gun to see whether they fit. If they fit, you just thread it in and you can tighten them down. If the threads don't fit your base plate, then you're going to want to use the nut that comes with the kit. And you're going to want to drill a 3/8 hole in the center of the base plate through the existing hole. And you're going to want to thread that on and lock it down. In this case, it's really not necessary because it threads directly into the base plate. Once I have it installed on my base plate, I want to get a rough idea how far above the grip the hose needs to come down. Now you can see I'm measuring from right about in the center of the grip, right along the line there, up to where the barb needs to come down. The line's flexible and it can push up into the grip a bit when we're putting this all together, but we want a rough idea. So I've got right about 25 millimeters above the grip that the fitting here extends. So write that number down, remember it, and we'll come back to that later. Let's go ahead and put the WRAITH back on the receiver. First thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to find the hole in this piece. See, as I rotate this piece, I don't know whether you'll be able to pick that up on the camera, but there's a blind hole drilled in the piece inside that lines up with the hole on the outside here. And what we want to do is we can use the small Allen wrench that comes with the WRAITH to hold this piece in place while we assemble it together. So let's go ahead and do that. Alright, so with the wrench in there, holding it in place, before we do that, we want to get our sling plate on. This is reversible for right or left-handed. Put it on. We're going to slide it through. You can see our threads extend on the inside of the receiver. We're going to take that little nut and go ahead and thread that on. Notice I still have the wrench in the hole here. That's to keep the stud from rotating as I try to thread the nut onto it. Here you can use your wrench if you want to snug this down. It's not really critical that get real tight, because once we tighten down the castle nut here, it's going to put tension on everything and hold it all together. So we're going to go ahead and tighten the castle nut down using the standard armorer's wrench. If you don't have an armorer's wrench, first of all, I highly suggest spending a few dollars and getting one. They're a very handy tool if you're going to be working on guns. If you don't, you can hack it, kind of like I'm going to do here, and use a punch and a hammer. Don't overdo this, but you can tap it down and snug it up, and that should be good. So we can go ahead and put the gearbox back in the lower receiver. In this case, all the wiring is going to go in the grip as well as the airline. So we're just going to go ahead and put it all in. Notice I'm going to tilt the gearbox back, slide the airline in, and then I'm able to tilt it forward. It's different than how you normally put together a gearbox, but because we modified the back end of the gearbox, we're able to do that. From here on out, it's just normal assembly if you're doing the WRAITH by itself. And we're going to switch back over and we're going to take a look at how to do the airline for the dual air sourcing. Okay, so we got all this back together, put our WRAITH CO2 stock on, and we have our wiring and our airline coming out in the gearbox. So really the last thing to do is to trim the line and attach this, this fitting. So what we're going to want to do in order to do that is we're going to want to take our grip. Generally this works best if you're doing this, if you put the wiring through first and then the airline. Nice thing about this airline is you can't kink it and damage it, so keep the airline held straight so it doesn't get pinched, and go ahead and slide that on up there. Okay, now you remember earlier we were measuring from the bottom of the grip. What I'm going to do is I'm going to trim this about flush with the bottom of the grip, making sure I don't kill my wiring while I'm at it. So now it's about flush with the bottom of the grip. I'm going to go ahead and pull the grip back off. And now I can go ahead and measure my 25 millimeters, was what I was at. When you're doing this to get started, you might want to, you will want to cut it a little on the long side. You can always remove a little bit more if you cut it too long. Alright, so we have drilled our hole here for our fitting. We used a 3/8 drill, had to work it around a good bit to open it up. It's a little bigger than 3/8. 10 millimeter would work easier, but you can make it work with 3/8 like we did. Just give it a little extra love for you guys that don't want to go out and find a 10 millimeter drill bit. At this point, we're going to separate the two halves. This is where the filter is down inside there. And this half is going to get pushed on to the barbed fitting here. Alright, so there are a few steps we want to do to make getting this all together easier. First is I want to open up a pathway between the main opening and the side opening. The reason for that is this fitting, has to fit through the main opening. Well, if the wires are there, that's going to be really tough. So what I'm going to do, you can do this just with a box cutter. Be careful. Or you can do what I'm going to do is, and I'm just going to take a small carbide bit on the Dremel, and I'm just going to notch it right across. So we're going to step across and do that here in just a second. Alright, so we got our little notch here. We're going to run the wiring through, and then we're just going to set it, use that notch to slide it over to the side. And we're going to run the fitting through, put it all back together. And now we're going to screw the two halves of the fitting back together, which you're going to really want a 5/16 wrench so you can grab onto that fitting down inside the grip a little bit. Get our battery plugged in. And this is where you can see if you are doing both a battery and an FCU, probably would fit, but it is going to be really tight up inside there. Our base plate can go back on, thread the retaining nut down, and we're going to go ahead and grab our screws. Alright, there she is. We can put in an empty cartridge, which this already has one. And we'll go ahead and plug in air. Anytime you're using external air, you want an empty cartridge in this WRAITH stock. And we're going to go ahead and put a CO2 cartridge in. She's good.